In the first nights of October, when the cornfields had begun to bow under their own dying weight, the people of Briar County woke to a sound that should never have carried as far as it did. A lullaby, soft, deliberate, threaded with a tenderness that didn't belong to any living voice. It drifted across the valley, over the river, through neighborhoods separated by whole miles of woods and farmland. Some said it reminded them of their mothers. Others said it felt like a memory from a childhood they never actually lived. But all of them agreed on one thing: it was meant for someone. And whoever that someone was, they never stepped forward. By sunrise, the sheriff's office had already taken 17 calls. Grown men with cracked voices describing the same melody. Women who hadn't sung to their children in decades humming it unconsciously while they spoke. Even the radio station, which signed off at midnight sharp, reported that the lullaby had bled into their equipment, faint but unmistakable, like a ghost leaning into a microphone. And in a county where people valued silence the way others valued gold, that alone was enough to stir old fears awake. But this wasn't the first time Briar County had heard something it couldn't explain. The archives tell a story buried under water-stained paper and missing reports, a story about a sound that once traveled these same hills long before there were roads or farms or fences. The ancestors wrote that the voice was not a warning, nor a comfort, but a reminder. A reminder of a promise broken so thoroughly that every generation afterward tried to pretend it had never been made. When I first stepped into the county's historical society, I didn't expect to find anything that mattered. Just another repository of fading maps and forgotten feuds. But tucked between two misfiled land deeds was the first thread of the truth, a weathered transcription made by a schoolteacher in 1911. In her careful handwriting, she described hearing the lullaby on a winter morning so cold that the creek had turned to glass. She said the melody wasn't human, though she didn't use that word lightly. She said it felt like something ancient was searching for what had been taken from it. And she ended the note with a line that chilled me far more than any superstition the county still clings to: it knows the bloodlines. It remembers them. Most people in Briar County pretend their families have clean histories, simple, hard-working lines that stretch back to homesteaders and mountain folk who minded their business and expected the same in return. But when you listen closely, when you sit with the oldest residents long enough for their guard to slip, you hear a different truth. A truth that smells of river mud and old wood smoke, of nights when doors were locked not against thieves, but against something that wandered in the dark asking for names. The lullaby returned on the second night. Same melody, same voice, drifting through the pines like it had been pinned to the wind. But this time, the county reacted differently. Hunters paused mid-field dressing, knives hovering over warm carcasses as their hands began to tremble. A trucker pulled to the side of Route 6 and sat there with the engine running, tears streaming down his face for reasons he couldn't explain. And in a farmhouse just outside the town line, an elderly woman, 93, nearly blind, rose from her bed and whispered, "Not again." I spoke to her granddaughter, who sat on the porch with a shotgun resting across her knees like it was family tradition. She told me her grandmother hadn't spoken that phrase in decades, not since the winter of '58. The year a newborn went missing. The year the river thawed early and carried something downstream that no one in the county ever forgot, though they refused to put it in writing. When the lullaby began that night, the old woman didn't hear a mystery. She heard recognition. Back in the archives, I found another fragment, a physician's note from 1884 describing a cluster of patients complaining of an auditory influence inducing somnol disorientation. That's how doctors used to say a song that makes you dream someone else's memories. He wrote that several families refused treatment, claiming the sound belonged to a covenant older than the county itself. He warned the Board of Health that ignoring the phenomenon would invite recurrence. His note was signed, filed, and never referenced again. And that's the pattern you see in Briar County's history, not denial, but avoidance. As though each generation came just close enough to the truth to feel its breath, then backed away before learning whose voice hummed through the fields. A truth they refused to claim even as it traced their bloodlines like a map inked in shadow. By the third week, the lullaby had become a fixture of daily life. Windows rattled to its rhythm, radios stuttered and whispered it during static, and dogs howled at nothing visible. People began to notice subtle changes. Neighbors who had once been cordial now spoke in hushed tones, avoiding certain streets. Children stopped venturing into the woods alone, even in daylight. And those who had grown up hearing stories of missing relatives or unexplained deaths in the family suddenly recalled details they had buried, like a dream half-remembered and too terrible to share. One farmer, a man who had spent his life cataloging weather patterns, told me he could predict when the lullaby would arrive. Not by clouds or wind, but by the behavior of the crows. They gathered in silent roosts the night before, their feathers puffed against the chill, their black eyes fixed toward the center of the county. And when the song drifted over the hills, he said, it wasn't just heard, it was felt in the marrow. It seeped into the bones like frost creeping along old timbers, cold and insistent, demanding attention. A librarian in the county seat, a woman named Marguerite, began noticing that certain books and records were missing pages. Not ripped, not destroyed, just absent, as though someone or something had claimed them. She confided that it often coincided with nights when the lullaby was strongest. When I asked her if she'd heard it, she paused so long I feared she might never answer. Then she whispered, it knows us. Every one of us. And it wants to be remembered. The deeper I dug, the more the melody appeared to intersect with Briar County's darkest moments. Fires that wiped out entire barns, children lost in the woods, sudden illnesses that swept through families and left no explanation. Each incident was isolated on paper, but when you layered them against the lullaby's historical appearances, a pattern emerged. And the pattern wasn't just tragedy, it was something far older, something tied to the lineage itself. It wasn't random. It was selective. Even those skeptical of superstition couldn't escape its reach. One night, a retired sheriff told me he had stayed up until dawn recording the melody on an old tape recorder. When he played it back, he said the tape hummed differently, containing notes he hadn't heard live. He tore the tape apart, yet the song lingered in his dreams for weeks afterward. It's not singing to the town, he told me. It's singing to us, our families. Our sins. Our debts. By the fifth night, Briar County had settled into a strange rhythm, a collective unease that pulsed beneath everyday life. Shops opened late, school buses ran empty for hours, and families gathered around radios that never quite functioned normally. Some said the lullaby was teaching them patience, others insisted it was a warning, but almost everyone agreed it demanded attention, whether they wanted to give it or not. People began leaving messages on community boards, not for each other, but almost as if talking to the song itself. A single note posted in the post office read, I hear you. I remember. I interviewed a man named Caleb, a third-generation resident whose family had lived in Briar County since before the Civil War. He had always dismissed the stories, called them old wives' tales. Yet he admitted to waking in the middle of the night, feeling an invisible hand brushing against his face, hearing the lullaby hummed softly in the shadows of his room. The thing about Caleb is that he had no children. No one to hum the song to. And still, the song remembered him. In my research, I found dozens of accounts, each more unsettling than the last. School teachers who fainted when it entered the classroom, old men muttering the words of the melody in their sleep, even animals that refused to cross certain boundaries after it passed. The lullaby wasn't a sound, it was an intelligence, one that had been walking alongside the people of Briar County for generations, taking note of every act, every failure, every hidden secret. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And then there were the disappearances. Not dramatic vanishings, not the kind that make newspapers, but small, almost imperceptible removals, a tool missing from a shed, a picture erased from a wall, a name deleted from a family Bible. Each erasure seemed to coincide with nights when the lullaby was strongest, leaving only a faint echo behind, a memory of something that had been there, a quiet confirmation that the song was keeping score. By the time I left the county, I realized the lullaby was not meant to be solved. It was not a story to be finished or a mystery to be solved. It was a ledger. A ledger of blood, of lineage, of ancestral deeds carried into the present. And the haunting truth is this: no matter how far one moves, the song follows. It remembers, it counts, and it waits. The origin of the lullaby remains impossible to trace. No singer, no recording, no hidden instrument has ever been found. Yet its existence is undeniable, threaded into the memories and bodies of those who dwell in Briar County. Older residents describe it as a voice that doesn't belong to anyone living, and perhaps that's true. It feels older than the county itself, older than the nation, older even than the forests that line the river. It is a witness, a keeper of truths we cannot bear to speak aloud, yet it insists we remember. One evening, I spoke to a historian who had dedicated decades to cataloging unexplained events across rural America. She had heard of Briar County's lullaby but had dismissed it for years, until a recording surfaced on a researcher's forum. She described listening to it as being pulled into another time, another consciousness. "It's not music," she said. "It's memory. It's grief. It's something alive that remembers wrongs, and it will not forgive the silence of those wrongs." Her hands shook as she spoke, and I realized she was not exaggerating. Families in the county began documenting their own encounters in secret journals, hiding them behind false walls or beneath floorboards. One such journal, passed to me by a local woman who refused to reveal her name, contained pages of trembling handwriting recounting the same lullaby heard by multiple generations. The words described its effect: a melody that induces recall of crimes, misdeeds, betrayals, and deaths long buried. Sometimes the entries end mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted by something unseen, something patient and eternal, waiting for acknowledgement. There is one detail that appears again and again, a chilling constant: the lullaby seems drawn to bloodlines. It does not haunt houses, it does not haunt roads. It haunts families. Children inherit it without knowing it, parents pass it unknowingly to children. Even those who leave the county report hearing it in distant cities, whispered through the static of late-night radios, carried by the wind over plains and mountains. It is inescapable, threaded into flesh and memory, a spectral ledger tracing every lineage that has ever lived there. And so the lullaby persists. It hums across Briar County every night, invisible yet undeniable, a ghostly chronicle of sorrow and transgression. It is a story that refuses to end because it belongs to no one and yet to everyone. Perhaps it is not meant to be understood. Perhaps it only exists to remind us that some histories cannot be buried, some debts cannot be erased, and some songs will always return to call the living to account. There are nights when even the bravest residents lock their doors and refuse to step outside, and yet the lullaby slips through anyway. It is never loud, never violent. It does not force itself upon you. It simply is, a gentle insistence, a reminder that the past is never truly past. It coils around your thoughts, entwines with your dreams, and surfaces in your waking hours in ways that make you doubt your own sanity. People report waking with a sense of being watched, of being gently judged, as though the melody itself carries the conscience of every ancestor who ever lived in Briar County. I spent nights wandering the hills, the forests, and the riverbanks, listening for it. At first, I thought it would guide me to some source, a hidden singer, a machine, an explanation. But there was nothing. No one, and yet everything. The lullaby seems less like a sound and more like an imprint, a living memory embedded into the soil, the wind, the very air. Some older residents say that those who listen too closely begin to see things, shadows that move contrary to the light, figures that appear only in the corner of the eye, fleeting faces that bear the unmistakable familiarity of kin you never met. I found myself thinking about why it chooses to linger. Perhaps it is not a curse, nor an accident. Perhaps it is a ledger, a quiet witness to all that the county refuses to remember. It knows the forgotten names, the untold betrayals, the children lost to silence, the debts unpaid across generations. Each note, each cadence, each delicate turn of melody is a record, a tally of those who have come and gone. And it waits, not in malice, not in anger, but in patience older than any living memory, ready to call the living to acknowledge their place in the chain of what was done and what was left undone. In the end, the lullaby is not a mystery to solve. It is a presence to reckon with, a truth too persistent to ignore. You cannot chase it down, trap it, or silence it. You can only listen, and in listening, you find yourself unearthing more than a melody. You unearth the very weight of family, the inheritance of shadow, the ledger of a history that refuses to be forgotten. And perhaps, somewhere in its gentle, terrifying cadence, there is a warning: history is patient. Memory is patient. And some songs will always return, and so, the lullaby continues, threading through the nights of Briar County as if the hills themselves were singing. It is no longer simply a sound, it is a presence that bends the perception of those who hear it. Families speak of waking in cold sweat, sensing the lullaby hovering just beyond comprehension, as if the melody itself is reaching for the unspoken secrets of their lives. Even those who have left the county cannot escape it. The song appears in dreams, whispers across the radio, in the faint hum of machinery at odd hours. It remembers, always, and it waits. There are those who try to rationalize it, claiming it is mass hysteria or some atmospheric anomaly. But the records, the journals, the testimonies across decades tell another story, one of continuity, persistence, and selection. It is not random. The lullaby chooses its audience with meticulous precision, threading through bloodlines, whispering reminders of unspoken acts, long-buried grievances, and forgotten names. A child might hear it in a crib, a parent in a kitchen, and a grandparent in the shadowed corner of a porch. It does not leave, it accumulates, growing heavier with each recollection, each recognition. What makes the lullaby truly horrifying is not just its persistence, but its intimacy. It does not frighten with screams or menace. It quiets, it observes, it draws you in. And in that drawing in, it reflects the hidden layers of family history, the secrets that no one speaks of, the shame passed quietly from parent to child, the tragedies that leave no records. It hums with the weight of memory itself, and the county, silent and tense, has learned to listen. Not all survive the listening unbroken. Some disappear quietly into the woods, some fall into long bouts of illness, some simply vanish from their own lives, as if the lullaby has marked them and taken them somewhere beyond sight. And yet, life continues in Briar County. Cornfields still sway in the wind. Children still play in the yards, oblivious to the persistent hum threading through the air. Adults go about their routines, carrying burdens they cannot name. The lullaby is not a curse that can be exorcised, it is a ledger, a witness, a presence embedded into the very bones of the county. You may think you can leave, but it leaves a trace. It reminds you of what you cannot forget, what you cannot escape, and what, no matter how far you travel, will always follow your bloodline. And for those who hear it now, the question is no longer why it exists. The question is simple, unavoidable, and terrifying: will you remember when it comes for you?